Hello, I'm John Feldt, and this is the Blue Water Outlook for the Southeast U.S. for the weekly water outlook recorded on January 20th, 2012. You know, I do coverage of this outlook for parts of the nation, and pretty much the story has been dry anywhere over the central or western U.S. But it was actually a very busy week over the Southeast U.S. We tapped the Pacific stream of moisture associated with the oscillation called the MJO that brought that Pacific moisture in mid and upper levels. At low levels, we had low-level moisture. And as a result, we had a prolonged multi-day widespread rain and eventually snow event. You can see here in yellow, this is 2 to 4 inches of precipitation. And the very heaviest rainfall, 5 inches or a little bit more, brushed parts of Mississippi, northern Alabama, and then it expanded as it got into the higher elevations of the Appalachians into Virginia. So that was a pretty significant rain event and snow event this past week. And what we see here is the percent of normal precipitation over the last week. And you can see that purple is 4 to 6 times normal rainfall for the week. Now, I guess what I'll point out here is look how abruptly this line here goes from well above normal in this region to well below normal in the southeast part of our region, and it really tapered off. Now, I mentioned that in last week's outlook that it'd be aligned along that thermal boundary, and that's indeed what it did between the very cold air and the warmer air. Now, as that cold air pushed in, there was a bit of snow. You can see the areas in purple here, these dots are 1 to 3 inches of snow, maybe some isolated amounts higher over Alabama and Mississippi. But look how it really blossomed as it got into the higher elevations of the Appalachians. That green indicates significant amounts of heavy snow, and I think this system had a lot of moisture, and when you get it into the cold air and the higher elevations, you get a lot more snow. Now, the extent of snow cover this morning as measured by satellite, you can see here, and most of the snow over Alabama, Mississippi appears to have melted. I'm sure there's some pockets here or there. But that was the type of snow with temperatures that, sort of a wet snow. It didn't stay around real long. But you can see that the snow is more significant over the higher elevations and where it extends across the nation. And as of this morning, about 30% of the nation was covered with snow. And if you compare that to the beginning of the year when 60% of the nation was covered by snow, you see there was a very significant decrease in the overall coverage since the beginning of the month. Now, with soils wet over Mississippi and Alabama, and with that heavy rain, you can see there was some flooding over the last week, and that will continue into the new week. I think for the most part, this is what I would call more your typical type flooding. It was, for the most part, within bank to minor flooding. Much fewer points went into moderate flooding. So this is sort of a typical flood event that you'd get this time of year. I've seen other ones where it's covered a lot more points and a lot more extensive flooding. But this is just a piece of the puzzle as we go throughout the winter months, perhaps setting the stage for later in winter or early spring. I'll be covering that in my newsletter, talking about vulnerabilities due to this rain. So there was some flooding, but it was somewhat scattered. It was significant. There hasn't been this much flooding for a while, but at the same time, I think as we go throughout the year, we'll be seeing more coverage and more greater intensity of flooding. From a drought perspective, I overlaid here the drought monitor, and the purple line, dashed line, is where the more significant rain occurred. And within that dashed purple line, I think you're going to see some improvement in the drought conditions. Very well could wipe out most of the lighter amount of drought over the Carolinas. Then as we get into South Carolina, into Georgia, the area of red there, that's probably going to be dampened down a little bit, but it'll still remain. But note how the core of drought over central Georgia was pretty much out of the heaviest rain. I think that's going to persist with not much improvement in that area. Now, last week was interesting. If you listen to my blogs, I talked about the MJO, different type of oscillation that tapped some Pacific moisture and brought it into our area, enhanced the rainfall. This week I'm going to get back to the Arctic Oscillation, which is one that we see throughout the year. And so far, this 2013, it dipped into this negative phase, popped back up into positive, and it really looks like now for the next week it's going to be in a fairly strong negative phase, and then sort of round out the month more of a modest negative phase. And this is your classic temperature pattern with this type of negative phased Arctic oscillation. The coldest air moves into the upper Midwest here. sag south into the Tennessee and Ohio valleys, and then much of the mid-Atlantic and Northeast U.S. The Southeast U.S. is right on the verge of the colder air up in the northern regions, such as the Carolinas, and then more moderate rain or temperatures over the southern part. And this is really your classic Arctic oscillation. And this is the jet stream as we go through the middle of the week. What you have here is you have the cyclonic flow along areas of low pressure in Canada, and really nothing real strong as far as energy in here. We're going to have some reinforcing pulses of cold air, and that's going to represent some weak pulses of energy, but not a whole lot. And it's going to be definitely over the northern section of the Southeast U.S., the Carolinas. Further south, it's going to be quite a bit less, not much energy at all, and fairly dry. So one of the model outputs that I look at, this is for not just this week, but into early next week, just modest amounts of rain. The blue is anywhere from a 1/4 inch up to a 1/2 inch. So there will be some precipitation from time to time with each passing front, but it's going to be very modest. As a matter of fact, the HPC forecast for the next 7 days, 1/4 inch to a 1/2 inch, and I don't think this is enough rain to change the directions of our rivers. Most likely it might slow them a little bit, but I think for the most part a 1/4 inch or a 1/2 inch is not going to do too much at all other than continue to very slowly saturate soil moisture. And if we look at a soil moisture forecast for the next week, we see pockets of light blue, pockets of light brown, and that's saying really not a whole lot of change one way or the other. Some areas that get the rain could get a little bit wetter. Some areas that don't get rain could get a little bit drier. So the takeaway points for this week's briefing, fairly quiet week, especially compared to last week. There will be some light precipitation this week in the form of rain and snow, but it should be pretty modest, and I don't think it's going to change water resources too much one way or the other. Thank you for listening to this week's Outlook. We'll be updating this in about a week.